I'm Darius Spearman, and you're watching African Elements. In this episode, we discuss the experiences of African Americans and Black women in particular during the Great Depression. I'll discuss how the New Deal fell short in addressing the needs of the most poor and the most vulnerable, and how Black women and Black radical organizations challenged the Roosevelt administration to do better. All that coming up next. Thank you for watching African Elements, where I take my classroom content and make it freely available to everyone. I believe education should be free, but if you'd like to support this work and become a Patreon subscriber for as little as $1 a month, click the link in the description. Members will receive ad-free content and other educational materials at various membership levels. Otherwise, a like and subscribe would also be greatly appreciated. In this episode, we discuss Black women and the Great Depression between reform and radical transformation. As economically devastating as the Great Depression was, Black people in general and Black women in particular experienced its harsh impacts disproportionately, as the socioeconomic conditions created by the economic collapse exacerbated existing employment problems for African Americans and women. When the economic crisis hit in 1929, the Hoover administration failed to meet Black demands for financial relief. Although more progressive and far-reaching, the Roosevelt administration was also plagued by racist policies that hurt Black employment and distributed relief inequitably. By 1934, when the federal government noted that 17% of whites couldn't support themselves, the figure for Blacks had increased to 38% overall. The figures were even more dire for Black workers in southern cities. In Atlanta, Georgia, 65% of Black workers needed public assistance. In Norfolk, Virginia, a stunning 80% had to apply for welfare. In addition to the effects on wages, the Depression also impacted Black families. In the early 1930s, the majority of Black people were still living in farms in the South, where they had been long exploited by white landowners. In rural Southern farm communities, families were often large and extended, a phenomenon that grew as families were forced to take in additional relatives, such as cousins or family friends. Black women faced an additional hardship from the Depression. Many worked alongside their families as sharecroppers, but by the 1930s, African American women were also more likely than white women to work outside the home. Often working in white homes as domestic servants, Black women found that even these jobs were in jeopardy when the full brunt of the Great Depression hit, as people of all races were struggling to find work. As such, Black women were influential in making their agenda clear and took full advantage of the New Deal era to either insert policy reforms addressing the needs of Black people or to push an even more radical agenda. The New Deal refers to the domestic program set up by Franklin D. Roosevelt to ease the problems of the Great Depression. The first New Deal was ushered in with the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. NIRA created a framework to regulate industry for fair wages and prices by establishing minimum wages and work hours. The goal was to stimulate economic recovery and put U.S. citizens back to work. Although the New Deal has been hailed for helping Americans recover from the Great Depression, as we'll find, for Black people, the New Deal often didn't live up to the hype. For example, the onset of the Depression sent the price of agricultural products plummeting due to overproduction. To address that problem, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was instituted to offer relief by paying farmers to reduce crop production in order to eliminate surpluses and increase market prices. Yet because of local distribution, most federal funds ended up in the hands of white landlords. After being paid not to produce crops, these landlords simply evicted African American sharecroppers and tenant farmers without pay, leaving Black farmers without work and without any means to earn a living. Even under the more progressive Second New Deal from 1935 to 36, African Americans in general and Black women in particular often failed to reap the benefits. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act of 1935, for example, establishing the federal social insurance program for those too old to work. However, the program excluded sharecroppers who were disproportionately Black. Domestic servants who were disproportionately Black and female were also among those excluded from Social Security benefits. The shortcomings of the New Deal were largely a result of resistance from Northern Democrats and Southern whites who opposed civil rights measures such as fair employment practices and anti-lynching legislation. Even so, a New Deal coalition emerged made up of diverse groups that supported Roosevelt's policies. The coalition consisted of farmers, laborers, people with disabilities, unions, and women's organizations. The New Deal coalition was a major reason for Roosevelt's victory in the presidential election of 1936. Black folks formed a significant part of that coalition, even though the New Deal programs were often inadequate and unfairly administered. That's because in many cases these programs were the only thing between them and starvation. Nevertheless, that didn't prevent black people from mounting a progressive challenge to the Roosevelt administration to do better. Some more radical blacks, especially black women, began to wonder whether the system could be saved at all. Among those advocating progressive change, Mary McLeod Bethune was an informal leader of a group of advisors who counseled the Roosevelt administration on racial affairs. Although not an official organization, the Federal Council on Negro Affairs, often referred to as the Black Cabinet, called on the administration to address the shortcomings of the New Deal. The council was quick to point out that blacks were disproportionately impacted by the Great Depression and disproportionately excluded from the benefits of the New Deal programs. The Works Progress Administration is where Bethune's influence and that of the Black Cabinet became apparent. The WPA was a New Deal program established in 1935 that provided job creation and economic relief for the unemployed. The WPA is most often associated with the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Writers Project. Both created programs to provide jobs for unemployed artists and writers. These programs brought relief to black artists in the age of the Harlem Renaissance, when the once flourishing artistic community was now struggling in the onslaught of the Great Depression. As head of the Division of Negro Affairs within the Works Progress Administration, Mary McLeod Bethune worked within the agency to set up public arts projects that employed black muralists, sculptors, photographers, and writers. Most notably, writers and social scientists like Zora Neale Hurston collected narratives and first-hand accounts of former slaves in the southern United States in the collection of interviews still available today. Those interviews can be accessed online through the Library of Congress website. Still, many believe that more radical change was necessary. Some question whether the New Deal reforms served to only preserve the systemic exploitation and racism embedded within the capitalist system. Was capitalism even worth saving? Radical organizations seized on the economic failures brought about by the Great Depression to gain a wider audience within Black America. Many saw the New Deal reforms as simply a stopgap measure to stave off more radical economic transformation. As Lashawn Harris points out, the moderate approach of the old guard, represented by those leaders who wanted to maintain a somber, reformist stance, contrasted sharply with that of a more militant new crowd, which was emerging from the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. The Communist Party, for example, had begun to target Black Americans as potential new members. Blacks were attracted to the Communist Party because it actively fought to alter the conditions of the working class and the poor. They also had a strong commitment to uniting blacks and whites in struggle. Members were drawn to its campaign against racism, inadequate relief, unemployment, and its fight for tenant farmers. Communist-sponsored groups such as the League of Struggles for Negro Rights, the Unemployment Councils, and the International Labor Defense, for example, were active within black communities during the 1930s. At great personal risk, members of the Communist Party also undertook the dangerous work of organizing sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the American South. For those faces at the very bottom of the well, black women, reformism and the status quo was simply no longer tenable. Some African American women were attracted to the Communist Party because it actively fought to alter the conditions of the working class and the poor. For many black women, from their perspective, the bold agenda and actions of radical groups like the Communist Party seemed a more viable option. As such, a significant group of African American women viewed the Communist Party as a potential vehicle for black liberation, along with gender and working class advancement. Their support for the Communist Party set the stage for an ideological battle between reformists like the NAACP and those who sought more radical transformation. NAACP leader Walter White, for example, wrote in a 1931 article for the Daily Worker that African American women who joined the ranks of the Communist Party were ignorant and uncouth victims who were being led to slaughter by dangerously bold radicals. The Great Depression left many black women without opportunities to escape poverty and oppression. As a consequence, these women sought programs and organizations that were progressive in their politics and offered support to black communities in the form of economic relief and social services. Even though they were often at odds, the programs and platforms put forward by folks like Mary McLeod Bethune, the NAACP, and the Communist Party collectively became integral to the struggle for black liberation and helped lay the foundation for future civil rights victories. What are your thoughts on liberal reformism versus radical transformation? Who was right? Were they both right? Both wrong? Let's have that discussion in the comments below. I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you in the comments.